Hey friends, welcome back to the Subculture Garage. I'm out here working on the gas tank for the Black Velvet Bobber, and today I want to modify this piece by chopping out this entire top panel and replacing it with something that's got a little more style. Now, like a lot of my other videos, this one's broken down into chapters. If you want to skip straight to the action, you can mouse over the timeline and click on the next chapter. But if you want to stick around for the intro, I think it's important to talk about the history and the evolution of some of these parts in order to really understand the basis behind their design. Now, this is the narrow Frisco mounted Sportster tank that's available from Lowbrow Customs, and I really like how it looks on this particular style of bike. If you're not familiar with the concept of a Frisco style tank, it refers to a relatively small gas tank that has a very shallow tunnel, and that allows the tank to sit directly on top of the backbone of the frame, giving the bike's profile a taller, slimmer silhouette, especially when compared to the larger, more traditional teardrop-shaped gas tanks that mount on either side of the backbone. Now, a Frisco-style tank is just one of many design elements in a much more complex style of custom bike that became very popular in the San Francisco Bay Area during the early 1960s. Most of those design elements were intended to be practical modifications aimed at adapting the entire bike to the heavy urban traffic conditions and the hilly terrain that San Francisco is known for. By shedding the weight of unnecessary parts and replacing the fat, balloon-style tires with taller, skinnier ones, the end result was a lighter weight bike that accelerated much more quickly and had a skinnier profile that allowed the rider to weave in and out of traffic. The San Francisco streets were also known for their steep hills and poor road conditions, which really made it necessary to give the bikes more ground clearance. It was pretty common to see a Frisco bike built with extended forks that would elevate the front end and create space between the frame and the ground. They would also replace the stock, low-hanging exhaust system with a set of pipes that mounted high on the frame to prevent them from scraping while leaning into turns, and it was pretty common to see them place the foot pegs high in the center of the bike. The new placement of the pegs, combined with a skinny Frisco-style tank, allowed the rider's knees to sit high and tight, similar to the position of a jockey riding a racehorse. That keeps the rider's weight right over the bike's center of gravity, which results in the rider having better control of the bike. That level of control, combined with the extra ground clearance, made it easier to take those tight turns in crowded city corners without even having to slow down, making a Frisco-style bike pretty well suited for the urban traffic conditions. Now, by today's standards, when we talk about urban riding, there are plenty of options that are far more practical than a skinny, hardtail bobber or chopper. But rewind the clock about 75 years and look at it from that perspective, and these were actually pretty clever modifications for their time. Plus, the total sum of all these design elements made for a style of bike that was objectively cool. Many of the styling cues, like mounting the tank high on the backbone, which draws your eye from the rear axle all the way up to the handlebars in one sweeping motion, those are design cues that modern bike builders are still using to this day. So say what you want about the Frisco style, but there's no denying the long-lasting impact it had on custom bike building culture. Now, when putting a small gas tank on a bike, it's understandable that you'd want to get as much fuel out of it as possible. This tank comes from Lowbrow Customs with the fuel filler hole right about here. And you can see I've already modified this tank once. I relocated the fuel filler here. But if I left it in the stock location and then mounted this tank on my custom frame that has a slight upward stretch when compared to a stock frame, you could see the maximum fuel level would be right about at this line here. And that means everything above that line would be unusable space. By relocating the filler to the highest point on the tank as it sits on the frame, I can get another quarter gallon or so worth of gas in there, which doesn't sound like much, but when the whole tank only holds a little over 2 gallons to begin with, a quarter gallon becomes significant. Now, when I modified the tank, I welded a sheet metal panel over the original location of the filler hole, and when I did that, the welds came out a little uneven, so I've been considering fixing this tank for quite some time. Now, I'm the type that always looks for silver linings and tries to turn problems into opportunities. And one thing I noticed about my rear fender is that the rib that runs down the center line is one of my favorite design features on this bike. But half the fender lives below the oil tank, which means when this whole thing is assembled and rolling down the road somewhere, you're not really going to be able to see that part of the rib. I'm also going to run a small solo seat that mounts directly to the fender. I welded on a seat mounting bung to the fender in a previous video when I fit the fender to the frame. And the plan for the seat is to mount it right about here, which means this portion of the rib is also going to be covered up. So the only part you're actually going to see is right about here and then a little bit more behind the sissy bar, and it's a little strange that it's one of my favorite design features and I'm covering up about 75% of it. So a thought popped into my head: what if I take the concept of a centerline rib and extend that all the way up through the fuel tank? I could fabricate a new top panel that has a rib that starts here a little behind the fuel filler and then runs down the center line and ends right about here. Then it would re-emerge behind the seat and run along the remainder of the fender, and that would give the design some continuity front to rear, which I think could look really slick. So what I want to do today is chop out this entire top panel from the fuel tank, including the portion that warped the first time I welded this up. Then I'll use a number of bodyworking tools and a piece of sheet metal to replicate this compound curve. And when I form that sheet metal into the shape that I want, then I'll put it on a bead roller. And I'll use the bead roller to form a rib the same size and shape as the one that's in the rear fender. And that'll run down the center line of my new top panel. Now, I've done some research on welding sheet metal and bodywork applications, and I learned some tips and tricks that I'll share with you when it comes time to weld my new top panel to the fuel tank. And the end goal for today's video is to get a smooth, one-piece tank that has that centerline rib, making this piece look like it was designed for this particular bike. So we're going to get started with that, and as always, like, comment, subscribe, share with your friends, and stay tuned, because I'm always either planning, filming, or editing the next Subculture video. Now, this is the bead roller that I used to press the rib into my top panel, and in general, I'm pretty happy with it. The problem I ran into is that I'm making the top panel out of 18 gauge steel, which is about the maximum strength and thickness that this particular tool was designed for. I ran it through a number of times, raising the pressure each time I did, and by the time I maxed out the pressure and moved about as much metal as I could with these roller dies here, the rib was only about half as tall as I wanted it to be, and it didn't really match the rear fender. Now, if I was using thinner sheet metal, like 20 gauge or 22 gauge, this would actually be the perfect tool. The problem with thinner sheet metal is that it's more susceptible to cracking in a high vibration environment, and the last thing you want is a crack in a gas tank that sits directly above a hot engine. So I decided to see if there were any fabrication shops in the area that had a more robust bead rolling machine that could help me out, and I ended up finding myself at a local hot rod shop called Phantom Works. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because they had a TV show that ran for about 8 seasons on Velocity and Motor Trend TV, and today I had a chance to meet with Dan, the owner of the shop. Turns out, he's a pretty cool guy. He's retired military, I'm active duty military, so we had some common ground there. And mainly the shop deals with classic cars, but he did show me a couple of finished motorcycles he had on the showroom floor and then talked to me about a vintage Harley project they have on the back burner. We also exchanged information and talked about the possibility of me doing some work for him from time to time. So that's kind of exciting. I went to the shop looking for help, but I ended up making a friend. They were able to hook me up with the use of a larger motorized bead roller, and that was able to press a rib into the top panel that's the exact size and shape that I need. So major thanks to Dan and Phantom Works for their contribution to the Black Velvet Bobber. Now, the next step in my process is going to be to chop out the original top panel from the gas tank and weld in my new piece.